group in a landscape. Frans Hals.
Portraiture was an especially relevant genre in 17th century Holland. The bourgeoisie became the most active of the social classes, and their interests and demand for artworks were focused on leaving a record of their social and economic importance. This trend allowed Frans Hals to become one of the most brilliant and innovative portraitists of his day. In his individual and group portraits, he employed significant new elements within the genre, and his artistic creativity placed him head and shoulders above his peers. After his death, his work was forgotten for nearly 2 centuries, until such painters as Manet and Van Gogh came to reassess its value.
Hals knew how to represent the poses and gestures of his models with great vitality and spontaneity, capturing the most natural moment, especially in their facial expressions. Using softer, smoother brushwork on the faces, he transmitted the individual character of each person who sat for him. Still, the technical skill evidenced in the rest of the composition is characterized by brushstrokes that are more bold and fluid. The artist reproduces the textures of various materials in a wide chromatic range of greys and ochres. This manner of painting portraits became his unmistakable style and brought him great fame.
The clothing, which is simple and austere, is notable not only for the quality of its silk and velvet, but for the extraordinary detail in the transparent lace collars, embroidery, buttons and buttonholes. Husband and wife hold hands tenderly, gazing at one another with affection, an allusion to the virtue of faithfulness in marriage. As a symbol of confidence and a sign that they will follow in the footsteps of their parents, the children are shown dressed in similar clothing.
Next to them, in the background, is a black servant, a distinctive symbol of the family's wealth. He poses with a starched collar, looking straight out at the viewer. A dog stands next to the daughter, further highlighting the family's faith and love. Just behind him, the viewer's gaze takes in a vast landscape of peaceful, sweeping lowlands. Easter Morning, Caspar David Friedrich. Caspar David Friedrich is the leading representative of German Romantic painting. His friend and fellow artist Willem Wegener described Easter Morning by pointing out some of the most essential characteristics in the piece.
3 women walk stiffly toward the cemetery in the early morning. The sun has yet to rise, and the moon is still visible high up in the sky, although it no longer lights up the landscape or casts a shadow. There are buds on the old-growth trees to the side of the path, and off in the countryside we can see the green sprouts that have survived the winter. Nature is celebrating its awakening.
Think about the meaning of the title. When and why do we celebrate Easter? It marks the celebration of the resurrection of Christ, and usually coincides with the beginning of spring. We are standing before a religious painting, although the artist has not made use of traditional religious imagery. How, then, has he managed to transmit the spirituality inherent in the theme?
The observer stands just behind the group of women, looking in the same direction. He feels he is walking on the same path, since it extends right up to the lower corners of the painting. Using these 2 resources, Friedrich manages to place the spectator inside the work, drawing him in with its symbolism.
Life is a path which leads us toward death, represented by the cemetery. Nevertheless, the Christian idea that death is not an ending is expressed through a reassuring landscape where everything is beginning to awaken. Night gives way to day, and bit by bit, winter makes room for springtime through the green buds on the trees. Thanks to the meaning given to each natural element in this Easter morning, Friedrich spreads a message of hope in a clear reference to the resurrection.
Thus the landscape becomes a place for expressing mystical emotions that are both personal and universal. Conversely, starting in the Counter-Reformation, predominantly Protestant Northern Europe began to handle religion in art through the use of day-to-day images that transmit the values of righteous living. In the case of Friedrich, landscape painting was the genre par excellence through which he could express his ideas.
Les Vessenots in Auvers, Vincent van Gogh.
The landscapes Van Gogh painted in Auvers are from the artist's final period. He arrived in this northern town in May of 1890 and would commit suicide just 2 months later. This period was extremely productive, dedicated to capturing the many facets of the rural setting. These days I am working hard and very quickly. In doing so, I am trying to express how desperately fast things happen in modern life.
The landscape in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum shows the area of Vessenots. The colourful roofs on the new houses with their slate and ceramic tiles intermix with the traditional cottages and their yellow thatched rooftops, which were already beginning to disappear.
There are many different villas and homes that are modern and bourgeois, very radiant, sunny and flowery. Set in an almost ebullient countryside, at the very moment when a new society is developing in the bosom of the previous one, it is not at all disagreeable. There is much prosperity in the air. Although the painterly contrast between the modern and the old would make up one of the artist's central themes during this time, this is not entirely evident in the present piece. It is visible only in the form of colourful, choppy brushstrokes, which mark the difference between the varying materials.
Neither is this one of the vast open countrysides that would be one of the recurrent themes of these final days. It is an intermediary piece. The raised horizon leaves very little space for the sky, but quite a lot for the earth, where we find a new contrast between the intimacy of the group of houses surrounded by trees and sown fields broken up by walls and paths, and the expanse of the wheat field. Faced with the vast fields of wheat, Van Gogh experienced the conflicting emotions of freedom and loneliness.
The emotional instability of the artist seems to be reflected in these opposing factors. Van Gogh is the great example in modern art of using artistic language as a symbol for his emotions, and of joining his life and his work in an inextricable manner. His vehement brushstrokes are thick with paint and rhythmically repetitive. His expressive colours and emotional take on the landscape blazed a definitive trail for subjectivism in 20th century art, expressed not only through subject matter, like the Romantic artists before him, but also through technique.
In his final letter to his brother Theo, he wrote,
"The truth is, we can only make our pictures speak."
Fränzi in front of a carved chair, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. The original core of modern masters within the museum's collection began with works by the German Expressionists, and more specifically with members of the Die Brücke group. Among these we find several representative pieces by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, the group's founder and primary driving force.
The piece before us, Fränzi in front of a carved chair, is one of the most appealing of all the artist's works. It features a girl of 12, identified as Fränzi, a young girl from the district frequented by the Expressionist painters, who served as a model for the group's members on many occasions.
The image of Fränzi was used for the cover of the catalogue from the group's first important exhibition in 1910, and as such, her face has become something of an icon for the movement. This piece, painted in oils, is considered an exceptional example of the group's early work.
The young girl, who is placed frontally in a half-length portrait, captures our attention with her face. It seems to be a mask, like something the artist might have seen in the Dresden Museum of Ethnology. The influence of primitive art can be perceived in the search for archaic shapes and the use of a schematic language that is removed from reality.
The artist hides the figure's distinctive features in order to show the idea of a young girl through her most characteristic attributes. Most notably, he highlights her gaze, with its outlined eyes and the girl's thick lips painted an intense red.
Fränzi is seated in Kirchner's studio on a chair that was carved by the artist himself. The back of the chair, in the shape of a human figure, can be seen behind her. The room has been decorated with various paintings which appear in the background.
These artists had workshops which became communal living spaces. The models did not pose in the traditional sense, but were rather part of everyday life, and were painted in poses that were natural and free.
Far from social and artistic conventions, this way of life coincided with a critical attitude toward a bourgeois society that was being blamed for the decadence of Western civilization. Within this context, members of the group returned to the idea of Paradise Lost, claimed by other avant-garde artists. A mythical land of freedom where man could live in a state of purity.
Hotel room. Edward Hopper.
A young woman who is partially undressed sits on a bed consulting what we know to be a train schedule, thanks to the artist's wife. The space is both constricted and framed by the wall in the foreground and the chest of drawers on the right. As though we were other guests walking down the hotel hallway, we see the open door and can't help looking into the room for just a moment. This is how Edward Hopper brings us into the scene. We are there, and we look in as we go by. At the same time, his characters are unaware that they are being observed. They remain wrapped up in their own thoughts.
Hopper uses images that are simple only on the surface in order to capture what we might glimpse briefly on a stroll through the city. He uses few elements without excessive detail. Still, if we stop to look, we will notice how developed his artistic language truly is. In this case, the strong diagonal of the bed directs our gaze from the woman to the background, where an open window allows us to look outside. But the flat blackness of the night prevents the gaze from finding a resting place, and it must return to the interior of the room to see what is happening there.
The figure's defeated attitude and shadowed face evoke a solitude that is heightened by the coldness of the depersonalized room, as anonymous as she is herself. The room is built of various vertical and horizontal lines, which outline panels of flat colour, cut through by the strong diagonal of the bed. Artificial lighting produces a strong contrast of light and shadow that brings a greater sense of drama to the scene.
This way of presenting his characters and the objects that surround them leads us to imagine a story for each of them. What do her suitcases tell us, or the various items of clothing? What will happen, what has already happened, may lay outside the painting, but it is crucial nonetheless. The attitude of the characters in the scene is preceded by, or anticipates, something we cannot see.
The city often plays a leading role in the work of Hopper. In paintings like this one, the young woman's loneliness is accentuated by our perception that she is in a public place, a hotel, which is in turn located in an even more public place, the city. Thus the girl's solitude transcends her own intimacy, speaking to us of the isolation of modern man.